Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant, and today is episode 3, the final installment of my series entitled The X1D Has Me Thinking. And by X1D, of course, I mean what I believe to be the single most important camera model of medium format camera maker Hasselblad's storied history since its original hit, the 500C, which was released in 1957. In fact, I'll go further to assert that it's the most important medium format camera of the last half century, period. Now, hold that thought. In episode 1, and I'll put the links into episode 1 into down below in the show more section and somewhere up here, I outlined how I'd be approaching this review, which is to say, based on what I assumed the X1D was meant to do, without regard to what it was not. At least at the beginning. I'm talking about product photography, fashion and portrait photography, landscape photography maybe, possibly street photography, not sports, not video, not event work, not photojournalism. I said I'd evaluate the camera without regard to price, again, at least at the beginning. That's because I wanted to evaluate the camera on its own merits, on its own premise and set of promises, and then decide if it's worth it. In episode 2, I walked through the history of cameras altogether because I wanted to answer the question, what does medium format even mean in 2018? It was fascinating to learn, for example, that the 120 film format of the 500C was first used a half-century earlier in the mass-market Kodak Brownie of 1900, and that medium format rose to prominence as a professional tool by being smaller, faster, and nimbler than the era's previous professional go-to camera, the 4x5-inch sheet film Speed Graphic. With much higher quality than the other format which killed the Speed Graphic, even more directly in photojournalism, 35mm. But then succumbed to the very same dynamic with the rise of those 35mm cameras and the subsequent evolution of full-frame digital. Hold that thought. I did all of this pre-work in typical Three Blind Men and an Elephant fashion in order to understand at a fundamental level what it was that I was actually seeing in the X1D, because I was convinced it wasn't just a camera. And with the benefit of hindsight, I think that's right. The X1D is actually two very distinct things. The first iteration of a new kind of Hasselblad medium format camera, much less expensive than, and a radical departure from, its previous digital model lineup, the H series. In fact, a radical departure from the form factor and aesthetic of the medium format camera design industry-wide to this point. And, 2, the camera that Hasselblad had to create in order to stay relevant, to continue to exist in an era dramatically different from the one in which the company and medium format first thrived. Taken on its own, the X1D is functionally a 9/10 Hasselblad H6D 50C at less than half the price, in a body less than half the size, in a form factor never quite seen before in medium format. Absent, perhaps, the one thing above all others that made the Hasselblad so exceptional when it first arrived on the scene, made the Hasselblad a Hasselblad, build quality and image quality notwithstanding, modularity. The X1D offers the same sensor and software interface of the H6D 50C and has the ability to use the same Hasselblad HC lenses via adapter. Unlike the H6D 50C, the X1D has the added benefit of being able to use the new Hasselblad XCD lenses designed specifically for it as well, all while previewing finished image directly through an electronic viewfinder. The X1D forgoes the H6D 50C's optical viewfinder, part and parcel of the modularity of its bigger brother, for 2 reasons. First, the X1D can then be smaller, lighter, and less expensive. And 2, the modularity of the H series, again in fact the basis for the aesthetic, if not actual functionality, of all current medium format cameras, has become vestigial anyway. There is little to no practical value for removable backs today, the way there was in the days of film. when you could have only one emulsion attached to the camera at one time, be that color or black and white, negative or transparency, low, medium, or high ISO. And by the way, high ISO meant what, 400? Or instant, Polaroid, to check exposure and or composition. Now, you know exactly why. With digital sensors and processors, plus the software that surrounds them, today you can dial in your ISO and colors, saturation, and then see the resultant image as it will appear or as it has just appeared right there in your viewfinder, on your rear LCD panel, on your monitor atop the camera, or on your tethered computer. This is also why, to my consternation, most people see little to no practical value for interchangeable finders the way they did back in the days of film. Now we can flip or tilt those rear panels and deal with dim screens, partially blocked screens, or faces in the dirt when in frustration we attempt to bypass the screen for that immovable EVF in all but a few cases. I get it. I get that we don't want to swap finders out, but we still have a need to view images from a variety of angles. Fuji solves this to a certain extent on their GFX50S with an optional $570 tilt adapter, which is cool, though I think this shouldn't be optional and shouldn't cost $1,000. I mean, that's almost the price, at least half the price, of the entire little Panasonic GX9 with its articulating EVF. But hold this thought too, because I'll have more to say about viewfinders in a bit. Back to price and why the X1D had to be created. Hassi had to bring the price of their cameras down dramatically. In an era of ascendant, full-frame, high-megapixel hybrid cameras of extraordinary capability, like the top-of-the-line Sonys, Canons, and Nikons, that max out around $6,000 but have models almost as good for $3,000 or even less on the one hand, and identically censored digital medium format cameras on the other, like the Pentax 645 and the aforementioned GFX50S. Even the $40,000 or $50,000 Phase 1 XF100 with Sony sensor, I assume, is the same or almost the same as the one in the H60-100C. Market demand just doesn't support a sufficient volume of medium format cameras priced like luxury cars to keep Hasselblad viable. I can't imagine that limited demand able to support any medium format camera in that price range for much longer. There's simply too much competition for too large a sector of the total market, driven by price sensitivity and the reality that there is too little benefit from modularity or the face-flattering perspective of the slightly longer focal lengths medium format uses at equivalent fields of view compared to full frame, which can be navigated. In-lens leaf shutters, yes, I know, super high sync, but this is important to an exceptionally small number of photographers and can also be navigated. And oh, by the way, this is not why Hasselblad went to leaf shutters in the first place. Workflow advantages, like tethering, which are now available in full frame and even crop sensor cameras. Even image quality. All things that were once decisive advantages of medium format cameras. But you might ask of just one of my assertions, incredulously at best or dismissively at worst, how can you possibly assert the difference in image quality is not dramatic? Well, that's a fair question. Here's how. 1. By looking at the math. The difference in actual surface area between full-frame digital sensors, 36 by 24 millimeter, and medium format sensors like the kind in the X1D, 43.8 by 32.9 millimeter, is not nearly as dramatic as the difference back in the film days between 35 millimeter and 6 by 6 centimeter, even 6 by 4.5 centimeter medium format cameras. We're talking about a ratio that used to be a bit more than 4:1 for 6 by 6, shrinking to a bit more than 3:1 for 6 by 4.5, and now sitting at less than 2:1 with the sensor in the X1D. Back then, a 4:1 difference in negative size meant much less magnification required for the final print, and therefore much smaller, tighter grain with the appearance of higher resolution and more finely rendered tonality. Yet, these were identical film emulsions, irrespective of format. Medium format drew its image quality advantage only from that size differential. Okay, and the glass. With today's sensors, things have changed. Yes, there are variations in color science, pixel pitch, bit depth, autofocus technology, and more with which to contend, not just size. Though the sensors are more often than not made by the same company anyway, Sony, so it's typically a generational thing. Today's lenses have changed too, with Sony's G Master series plus glass from Zeiss, Sigma, and others in E-mount for the full-frame Sony A7 series on the one hand, say, and constantly evolving software and processor gains on the other, along with the shifting balance between physical and computational correction. Medium format glass may not hold the advantages they once did the vast majority of the time. But even where there are differences in bit depth, 14-bit in cameras like the A7R III versus 16-bit in the X1D, little to no or even negative difference in dynamic range, 15 stops for the new A7 III, say, versus 14 stops for the X1D, some measure of difference in raw, uncorrected image quality between the two different formats' lenses. The harsh reality is that limitations of the medium in, size at, and distance from which images are actually displayed, be it a magazine cover or a website, even archival printing paper at less than wall-sized differences, and maybe not even then, based on distance, conspire to minimize those differences. Now, I also feel comfortable asserting this by looking at actual images I capture, but hold that thought also just for a little bit because we'll be getting to it in a few minutes. These things all show up in pricing pressure. In fact, as I'm releasing this video, the X1D can be had for $6,500, down a couple of grand from its launch price, within a few bucks of its nearest and fiercest competitor, the GFX 50S, and within $1 of the Nikon D5, a top-of-the-line full-frame camera, which in a Russian doll kind of way is now under assault by mirrorless cameras costing thousands less, sometimes with smaller sensors costing even less. Fujifilm looms even larger in understanding the reason why the X1D is the camera Hasselblad had to make, though this has less to do with price and more to do with control. That's because Hassie's first H-series camera, the H1, and the 35mm based X-Pan were joint developments with Fuji. How much of the H-series componentry or lenses were then or are now manufactured by Fuji is unclear to me. I know that Hasselblad cameras are assembled by hand in Sweden, and they do have a manufacturing facility of some sort in Gothenburg. But what is clear to me is that in order to take control of its own destiny, Hasselblad had to come to rely upon itself as much as possible. Put differently, I think Hasselblad reached an inflection point a few years ago which demanded that it recognize the realities of a new era, as it did when it shifted from the original V-series to H-series back in 2002, and essentially sever itself both from the traditional concept of medium format and from manufacturing entanglements over which it might have had precious little leverage. This is not, by the way, anything I've heard from either manufacturer, but it is an Occam's razor explanation for the X1D. The traditional Hasselblad line had grown too expensive, with too much that didn't matter anymore, and the company faced an existential crisis: respond or exit. That's how important I think the X1D is to Hasselblad. And that's what they did. With the X1D, Hasselblad has created a pathway more under its own control, except for, at least for now, the sensor. It is a camera both for existing Hassie shooters and for photographers wanting to shoot Hasselblad glass on Hasselblad cameras at more, shall we say, modern prices. Hassie has done it in a novel way, unlike Fuji or Pentax or Phase 1. It freed itself from the conventional medium format form factor altogether, one appropriate to the era in which we now work, live, and play, and with a smartphone-like software interface, which I think is the best in the business. You can look at previous videos I've done to see what I mean, and I'll put those links in as well. But as we now move on to the camera itself, I want to make a crucial point that I think seems to have been lost too often in previous reviews of the X1D, which is this. Even with such a critical product, there were bound to be teething problems. And in this regard, I really want to stress this. Hasselblad was never going to be different from Canon or Sony or Panasonic, or you pick your example from any other industry, or itself from the earlier years, which may or may not impact your decision to buy one, but at least should put the X1D's early problems in context, because those teething problems are still being sorted, firmware improvements notwithstanding. Whether it was the 3 generations of Sony A7 models it took to get to reasonable battery life and resolve overheating issues, the bloated 4K codec and crop factor that still plagued Canon's 5D Mark IV 2 generations after it basically created the hybrid market, Panasonic's continuing autofocus challenges across the line, Hasselblad's own original 1600F with focal plane shutter issues, or moving on to other product categories altogether, like Apple's iPhone antenna gate, Tesla's autopilot crashes, or drug manufacturer Merck's Vioxx debacle, it's clear that it takes time to get things right. In other words, the X1D is the opening salvo, I hope, in a much longer game. Now, some of you may think of this as the perspective of an apologist, but that's not it at all. I don't get paid for this review. I don't get to keep the gear. There's nothing in it for me other than the gratification of sharing what I learned with you. Well, now that that comes out of my mouth, I do get a couple of pennies on the dollar when you use our affiliate links. Literally, a couple of pennies. Although, there is one other thing in it for me, and I think for you too. I really want to see Hasselblad survive and thrive, because they offer something special which makes the market, and us, richer for it, I think. The perspective and ambition of practitioners of the art of photography and purveyors of industrial and now user interface design. But hold this thought too, because there's industrial design and there's user experience, and those should be, but are not always, aligned. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get into the camera and lens system for it, which I will sum up this way. A beautiful work in progress. In need of work. As I'm telling you this in March of 2018, just months after this first generation X1D is finally shipping in volume, the X1D and its lenses, the XCD line, are bold. They're risky, they're unique, they're beautiful, they're intriguing, they're capable of tremendous image quality, and they're frustrating. For me. For some of you, they will be simply magnificent. And for others, complete non-starters. Which is fine in either case. I think the X1D is exciting for pure photographers committed to 10/10 image quality, and who can control the variables in a shoot like lighting and pace. Those wanting, but until now unable to afford access to Hasselblad glass or the Hasselblad feel. Those who prefer to focus manually. The X1D's manual focus peaking is outstanding, though these are still fly-by-wire lenses. Those who feel that most, if not all, high-volume cameras today have become more like massively kludgy, bloated software programs with optics attached than real cameras. And those who enjoy industrial design. If you want to get into the Hassi system at this level of digital image quality, at this resolution, you can do that right now at a price never before possible, not even by buying used, and get the benefit of profoundly excellent optics, especially for product and fashion photography, disciplines where you are pre-visualizing the imagery and, again, controlling just about every aspect of the shoot. The X1D is not yet, however, ready for hybrid image makers, videographers, photographers thinking about moving up from and used to the capabilities of top-end, full-frame, high-megapixel digital cameras. As for the lens line, I found extraordinary image quality, beginning with the three lenses I had on hand, the 90, 45, and 30mm glass, edge-to-edge sharpness, wide open, and a complete absence of the kind of lateral and spherochromatic aberration that bedevil even high-end, full-frame glass like the otherwise gorgeous Zeiss Milvus 100mm f2. This is without in-body software correction, mind you. Freaking stellar. On the other hand, I learned that a smaller format camera, relying on pixel shift technology, in this case, even the Micro Four Thirds Panasonic G9, can get far closer to the innate image quality of the X1D for the kind of images you'd create in product photography than certainly I'd imagined. I found that for people photography, on the street, when I got it right, like here in front of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, or in low light indoors at a local Starbucks when I could hold it steady at relatively slow shutter speeds and ISO, or back outside for urban landscapes in bright light, heck, an actual natural landscape shot, the X1D's image quality was somewhere between superb and sublime. It's when you look very closely that you see it, which, while not something that the vast majority of viewers would ever notice through their media of choice like smartphones, tablets, magazines, e-zines, I mean, what's a print these days, right? People like you and I do. Except when we don't. The sensor's superiority usurped by a too slow shutter speed in a too unsteady hand, mine, and where the IBIS, superior autofocus, and greater depth of field for a given aperture of the G9 served as great equalizers, and in some cases, clearly served to best the X1D altogether. When it comes to high ISO videography, I found that the contrast detect AF and the, well, I'm not quite sure if it was the sensor, the processor, the codec, or something else. Whatever it is, just not ready for prime time, even compared to Micro Four Thirds, let alone full frame. I don't want to make too big a deal of this because, to be fair, Hasselblad has been clear that the current video capability is little more than a marker for further development, while Sony's third iteration of the A7R3 is stunning, and Panasonic's new GH5s punches way above its weight class. I also experienced glitches, even with the latest firmware. Sometimes, a couple of times, the camera just froze, something which, after speaking with Hasselblad, you can chalk up, in my case, to incompatibilities with the latest SDXC UHS2 US3 Class 10 cards. Interesting to contemplate whether or not the X1D was designed and spec'd before these were available, or known to Hasselblad designers, or known but ignored. I experienced a reluctance for the camera's external sensor to consistently recognize that I'd put my eye up to the viewfinder, resulting in the EVF remaining dark. Another call to Hasselblad, and another acknowledgement that its operation is suboptimal. Separate from teething issues, I wish the X1D's EVF offered greater eye relief, in fact a bigger EVF altogether. Hold this thought, we're coming to that as well. Finally, I came to distinguish the visual and tactile appeal of the X1D on the one hand from what were, for me, while in motion, awkwardly placed, two similar feeling buttons, and the surprisingly difficult to use mode dial on the other. I'd have liked it to poke out higher and be easier to grasp while wearing gloves. I did love the fact, however, that every button was engraved with its actual purpose. When it comes to lenses, Hasselblad and the third-party ecosystem around it can, and cannot, compete with the breadth of autofocus and manual focus lenses available for, say, the Sony line. While you can use H-series HC lenses via adapter, as well as the design for it XCD lenses on the X1D, and use beautiful old-school V-series manual focus lenses on it via adapter too, you won't be able to use the internal leaf shutters. At least, not on the V-series lenses with the photodiox adapter. I'm not sure about the H-series lenses, and Today being Sunday, I didn't want to bother Dan Wang, all-around good guy and product manager over at Hasselblad, to find out. Which leaves us where exactly? Well, it's not a camera for me at this point in my journey and its evolution, but that shouldn't be a newsflash to anyone familiar with my current preoccupations and budget. I'd say the X1D certainly could be for others, and if Hasselblad takes good care of what are essentially still the early adopters buying now, and fleshing out its financing options to make it easy to ride hardware upgrades, I think it has the opportunity to get this profoundly right and reaffirm incredible brand loyalty for existing Hassie shooters while inculcating that same level of enthusiasm in a new generation of Hasselblad shooters. What is the X1D for me? Well, first and foremost, a privilege. I'm fortunate to have the opportunity to go hands-on with a legendary brand, incredible glass, and the highest resolving, most beautiful rendering sensor I've ever used. In the process, I've developed deeper insights into the state of cameras and lenses in 2018, and myself, I understand better than before the appeal of medium format to a certain kind of shooter. For example, it may be possible to navigate around the advantages of longer focal lengths or leaf shutters or incredible colors when working in a smaller format, but that doesn't make it desirable or preferable. I see even more clearly my distance from that profile and why that distance exists. But I also understand, and really in awe of the distance Hasselblad has come as a company from the H series, which, like other classically conceived medium format cameras, digital or not, have hit the wall in my book, and where the company can go from here. I applaud Hassie for being bold. I applaud DJI for recognizing, I think, what Hasselblad could become. Though I suspect a good chunk of this will be prioritized toward commercial, aerial, and industrial applications. I am happy at the thought that a relatively small team of dedicated craftspeople in Sweden can continue to exist toward the end of the second decade of a very, very strange new century. And in fact, I'm very excited at what this camera, or the cameras it spawns, could look like a few years from now, if the company can and is willing to make the investments. I imagine what can happen when DJI applies its own software expertise to pick up where Hasselblad has left off, continuing to make complicated things like the software interface simple. Its gimbal expertise to create incredible in-body image stabilization, its sourcing and manufacturing prowess to shorten product iterations and reduce component costs, its relentless pursuit of its own photo and video prowess to redress video and autofocus performance. And then goes further when the joint Hassie-DJI team reimagines what elements of medium format are still relevant today, not from an engineering or software programming perspective, but from a very human perspective, that of the practitioner, the artist, the hybridist. Things like dramatically easier viewing. The Leica SL has a 4.4 million dot EVF, but what I'm really interested in, and what medium format had in its heyday, at least compared to 35 millimeter, is a dramatically larger viewing area. Hey, maybe DJI goggles can be connected to Hassie cameras to give photographers not a 0.78x or 0.83x view, but a virtual IMAX view of their image. Or maybe they just give us an articulating EVF, which is 2x. That would be amazing. Maybe they are uniquely positioned to break into hybrid shooting by reintroducing modularity in a way no one has done yet, beginning with an audio extension with dual XLR inputs that is functional and gorgeous and well balanced in hand. We don't need motor winders. We don't need film backs. We don't need weight and bulk sitting above the camera in the form of an XLR adapter. But what if we could add something that integrated with the camera as beautifully as a film back of old, which allowed a pure stills camera to become an awesome video camera? Not only an audio unit, What about a ProRes or RAW video back? What a magnificent upgrade path that could be, without costing pure photographers money and weight they don't want to spend. And please, do bring back somehow the ability to shoot from waist levels. EVFs give us the opportunity to see that unreversed and not upside down. Maybe the practitioners and industrial designers at Hasselblad and DJI can apply the lessons of the past to create 21st century industrial works of art that work artfully for artists. With more, but not too many, real buttons, prioritized and shaped, positioned by frequency, criticality of use, and the recognition that real photographers also shoot outdoors in the cold with gloves. This is the kind of future I can imagine for this camera. This is the kind of future I can imagine for Hasselblad and DJI. This is the kind of future for which I would pay. And I bet others would too. But hey, that's just me. And I've been wrong before. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below, share, add to a playlist. Please support our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links or even making a contribution directly via the PayPal link below. As always, we thank you for it. For Three Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. See you next time.